radiates. Most people never see it coming, and that is the part that should terrify you. Because when an empath finally stops caring about you, there is no dramatic exit. There is no screaming. D8s. There is no confrontation. There is no moment where they sit across from you and tell you what you did wrong. There is just a quiet that descends, a stillness that feels almost normal at first. Radiates. And by the time you realize what has happened, by the time you finally notice the temperature in the room has changed, it is already finished. The decision was made weeks ago, maybe months ago. Radiates. And you were the last person to know. This is one of the most misunderstood psychological phenomena in human relationships. People spend enormous energy trying to understand why empaths are so giving, so patient, so emotionally available. But almost nobody studies what happens when that giving stops. Yet almost nobody examines the internal process that leads an empath from total devotion to total withdrawal. And that gap in understanding is costing people the most important relationships of their lives every single day. So today we are going to go deep into that process, not surface level. Radiates, not the kind of shallow explanation you have heard 100 times. We are going to examine the actual psychological architecture of what happens inside an empath when they reach their limit. Radiates. We are going to look at the neuroscience, the behavioral patterns, the emotional progression, and most importantly, the warning signs that almost every person misses until it is far too late. D8s. Because if you are in a relationship with an empath, whether that is romantic, familial, a friendship, or even a professional relationship, radiates. Understanding this process might be the most important thing you ever learn about human connection. Let us start at the beginning, and the beginning is not where most people think it is. Radiates. Most people assume an empath stops caring because they got hurt, and that is partially true. But it is not the complete picture, because empaths get hurt constantly. That is almost a defining feature of how they move through the world. They feel everything more intensely. They absorb emotional information from their environment the way a sponge absorbs water. A8s, they pick up on subtle shifts in tone and body language and the energy beneath what someone is saying versus what someone actually means. And because they feel all of this, D8s, they also get wounded more often and more deeply than people who process the world less sensitively. But here is what most people do not understand. An empath does not stop caring because they got hurt. Radiates. An empath stops caring because they got tired of being the only one trying. Those are two completely different things, and the distinction matters more than almost anything else I will say today. Its pain alone does not shut an empath down. What shuts them down is the exhausting soul-level recognition that the care they are extending is not being met with genuine effort in return. It is the slow accumulation of evidence that their emotional investment is being taken for granted. It is the pattern recognition that eventually becomes impossible to deny. And empaths, radiates, because of how deeply they process emotional information, are extraordinarily good at pattern recognition, which means once they see the pattern clearly, they cannot unsee it. And that moment of clarity radiates. That moment where the pattern becomes undeniable, that is where the withdrawal begins. Now understand something critical about how an empath arrives at that moment, because it does not happen overnight. It never happens overnight. There is an entire internal journey that occurs before an empath reaches the point of detachment, radiates. And most people who are on the receiving end of that detachment never witness the journey, because empaths tend to process internally. They tend to suffer quietly. They tend to keep extending grace long after most people would have walked away, because at their core, empaths believe in people. They see potential. They feel depth in others that others sometimes cannot even feel in themselves. Radiates. And they hold on to that potential with a ferocity that is almost incomprehensible to people who do not share that orientation. This is what makes the eventual withdrawal so jarring. Radiates, because the people around the empath got used to an almost unconditional level of emotional presence. They got used to someone who would always answer the call, who would always show up, 88s, who would always find a way to understand, to forgive, to extend one more chance. And when that person suddenly goes quiet, radiates. When the warmth disappears and is replaced by something that feels almost like a stranger, the shock is enormous because nothing in the relationship seemed to prepare them for this moment. It radiates, except everything did. Everything prepared them for this moment. They just were not paying attention. Let me take you inside the empath's experience. D8s, because this is where it gets psychologically fascinating. 88s. Research in the field of high sensitivity and emotional intelligence consistently shows that people with deep empathic processing do not experience relationships the way the average person does. D8s. For most people, a relationship is partly transactional, not in a cold or calculated way, but in a natural human way. There is a give and take that operates almost automatically. When the balance tips too far in one direction, most people feel the discomfort, name it, address it, and adjust. The feedback loop is relatively short. For an empath, radiates, the feedback loop is dramatically longer because empaths tend to override their own discomfort in service of the relationship. They sense the imbalance early, often very early. D8s. But instead of immediately addressing it, they absorb it, they rationalize it, they tell themselves a story about why the other person is struggling, why they deserve more patience. E8s. Why love means continuing to give even when giving is painful, and this internal narrative keeps them invested long past the point where most people would have begun pulling back. E8s. But here is the psychological trap buried inside that dynamic. Every time an empath overrides their own needs to accommodate someone else, E8s, a small deposit is made into what we might call an emotional debt account. The empath is not consciously keeping score. They are not calculating what is owed to them, E8s, but the body keeps the score even when the mind refuses to. And over time, those deposits accumulate into something that becomes physiologically unsustainable. There is actual research behind this. Studies on emotional labor and empathic burnout show that people who consistently extend high levels of emotional attunement without reciprocity experience measurable increases in cortisol levels, it's disruptions in sleep architecture, decreased immune function, and over time, a neurological adaptation that begins to dull the very sensitivity that defined them. In other words, the body eventually protects itself by numbing, not as a choice, but as a survival response. And this is one of the most heartbreaking dimensions of what happens when an empath stops caring. Because in many cases, the withdrawal is not fully voluntary. It is biological. Idiots. The nervous system has absorbed such unreciprocated emotional weight that it begins to shut down certain pathways of connection as a form of self-preservation. The empath is not choosing to stop feeling, their system is choosing it for them. And by the time this happens, the damage runs very deep. Now let us talk about the specific stages. Radiates, because there is a recognizable progression here, and understanding these stages is where this conversation becomes practically useful. The first stage is what I call the stage of secret hoping. Radiates. This is early in the pattern when the empath first begins to notice that something is off. The relationship feels unbalanced. The emotional investment is not mutual. Eights. The depth of care flowing in one direction is not being matched, but the empath does not name this. They do not confront it. What they do instead is begin hoping quietly and privately that things will shift on their own. They hope the other person will wake up. They hope the next conversation will be different. Radiates. They hope that if they just keep showing up with the same level of love and presence, eventually something in the other person will respond. This stage can last an extraordinarily long time. Years, in some cases. Because hope is a powerful anesthetic, it dulls the signal of pain just enough to keep the empath invested. B8s. And empaths are particularly susceptible to hope because they are wired to see potential. They look at the person in front of them, and they see not just who that person is, but who that person could be. And they love that version with the same intensity they love the present version, which makes letting go feel like a betrayal of something real, even when the real thing was never fully there. The second stage is the stage of quiet communication. The empath, after a prolonged period of secret hoping, begins to express their needs. But notice the word I used, quiet, because empaths rarely lead with ultimatums. They rarely make dramatic declarations. They begin by softly, carefully, sometimes almost apologetically, naming what they need. Radiates. They bring it up in a moment of closeness. They frame it as gently as possible to avoid causing pain. They are almost impossibly considerate even in the act of advocating for themselves. Radiates. And this is where many relationships make a critical error, because the person on the receiving end of this quiet communication often does not register its importance. The gentleness of the delivery creates the impression that it is not urgent. The absence of anger makes it seem optional, and so the message gets heard but not truly received. The other person nods, perhaps offers a brief acknowledgement, and then returns to their previous patterns without real adjustment, and the empath notices. The empath always notices. Radiates. The third stage is what I consider the most dangerous and the most misunderstood. I call it the stage of invisible grief. Radiates. This is where the empath begins to mourn the relationship while still being in it. The quiet communication did not produce change. The secret hoping did not produce change. And now something begins to shift at a fundamental level. The empath starts letting go, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally. They begin the process of emotional separation while all external appearances suggest everything is fine. This stage is dangerous because it is invisible to everyone around the empath. From the outside, the relationship looks unchanged. The empath is still present, still engaged, still going through the motions, but internally they are processing a kind of grief that is almost indescribable. Radiates. They are saying goodbye to the version of the relationship they believed in. They are watching the gap between what they hope for and what is actually their grow too wide to bridge. Radiates. And they are beginning slowly and painfully to accept the truth. And here is what makes this stage so significant from a behavioral science perspective. Ideates. Once a person begins this internal process of grief, the outcome is almost always the same, because grief is a process of integration, not reversal. Ideates. You do not grieve something and then return to hoping for it. You grieve it and then you release it, which means by the time an empath reaches the stage of invisible grief, the relationship has already been lost. The physical departure has not happened yet, but the emotional departure is already underway. An emotional departure in a deeply feeling person radiates is always the point of no return. The fourth stage is withdrawal, and this is the stage most people finally notice, usually far too late. The empath begins pulling back in measurable ways. Radiates. They stop initiating. They stop going the extra mile. They stop offering the emotional depth and presence that define the relationship. They become pleasant but distant. D8s. Engaged in surface but absent beneath it. They answer the question but do not volunteer. They show up but do not lean in. And as someone paying close attention, the difference is stark. Radiates. To someone who was not paying close attention before, it is confusing and alarming. This is the moment when most people start trying to fix things. They notice the withdrawal and they panic. D8s. They start asking what is wrong. They start more attentive, more present, more interested. They suddenly show up with the emotional availability that was absent for months or years. D8s. And the tragic irony is that this is exactly what the empath needed, but it is arriving after the empath has already finished grieving. It is arriving after the internal decision has already been made. Radiates. And so the sudden effort, rather than being received as meaningful change, is experienced by the empath as confirmation of a painful truth, that the person was capable of this the whole time. D8s. They just chose not to show up until they felt they were losing something. That realization does not bring the empath back. That realization finalizes the withdrawal. The fifth and final stage is what I call complete energetic absence. This is the stage most people confuse with coldness, but it is not coldness. Coldness implies hostility. Radiates. What an empath enters in this final stage is something closer to neutrality. They do not hate you. They do not resent you. Radiates. They do not think about you with the intensity that once characterized how they held you in their inner world. You have simply become someone they used to love differently. And that neutral space, D8s, that absence of the charged emotional energy that once defined how they related to you, that is the most final thing in human relationships. Because you can warm coldness, you cannot ignite neutrality. Radiates. Now I want to speak directly to two different groups of people watching this, because this conversation has two entirely different sets of implications depending on which side of this dynamic you occupy. Radiates. If you are an empath watching this, I want you to understand something about your own process that most people will never validate. What you go through before you stop caring is not weakness. E8s. It is not naivety. It is not some character flaw that you need to fix about yourself. The depth of patience you extend, the lengths you go to before giving up, the internal journeys you take before you let go, those things reflect a genuine and profound capacity for love. They reflect a belief in human beings that is actually quite rare and quite beautiful. Radiates, even when it comes at great personal cost. But I also want you to hear this clearly. The moment you begin to recognize the pattern, D8s. The moment you start to sense that your investment is not being matched, that awareness is not something to suppress. That awareness is your system telling you something true. D8s. And empaths have a powerful tendency to override that awareness in the name of loyalty, in the name of potential, in the name of a love that they feel deeply even when it is not being honored. Radiates. Learning to trust that early awareness before the grief, before the withdrawal, before the exhaustion, that is one of the most important forms of self-respect an empath can develop. D8s. Because here is the truth about your caring. It is not infinite. It may feel infinite. You may have spent years operating as though it were infinite, but it is a resource. And like any resource, it can be depleted. And once it is depleted in the context of a specific relationship, restoration is extraordinarily rare. Not because you are incapable of caring again, radiates, but because the nervous system learns, it records the pattern, and it becomes increasingly resistant to reinvesting in the same dynamic that caused the depletion. That is not bitterness, D8s. That is intelligence. So the most important thing you can do if you are an empath who feels yourself approaching any of the stages I described today is to name it. Radiates. Not to the person who is failing to show up, not in a confrontation, but to yourself. Name the stage you are in. Name the grief you are already carrying, because invisible grief is still grief. D8s. It still costs you something, and the more clearly you see your own process, the more power you have over how it ends. If you are the person who loves an empath, radiates, or who has loved an empath and is now experiencing their withdrawal, I want to speak to you with equal honesty, because what you are feeling right now is real. The confusion is real. The loss is real. Radiates. The desperate wish that you could go back and do things differently is completely understandable. And I am not here to condemn you. I am here to tell you the truth. Radiates, because the truth is the only thing that is actually useful at this point. The empath in your life did not stop caring because of one moment. They stopped caring because of 1,000 small moments. Radiates, each of which communicated something about how you valued their investment. And the reason it feels sudden to you is because you were not tracking those moments the way they were tracking them. Radiates, not with a ledger, not with resentment, but with the same sensitive attunement that makes them who they are. They were feeling every one of those moments. Radiates. They were absorbing the information in every one of those interactions. And you, perhaps without realizing it, were sending a consistent message about what you considered worth your effort. D8s. This is not about blame. Genuinely, it is not. Many people who take an empath's care for granted do not do so out of malice. They do it out of assumption. D8s. They assume the care will always be there because it has always been there. They mistake the empath's consistency for unconditional permanence. D8s. And they fail to recognize that the consistency was not automatic. It was chosen over and over again in the face of repeated evidence that it was not being honored in return. Ideates, and eventually the choosing becomes too costly, and eventually the empath stops choosing it. If you still have the opportunity to change something, understand what change actually means in this context. Radiates. It does not mean grand gestures. It does not mean apologies delivered dramatically. It does not mean suddenly becoming everything you were not for the past year in the span of 2 weeks. D8. The empath's nervous system is sophisticated enough to recognize performance. And after everything it has processed, it has become highly attuned to the difference between genuine shift and reactive effort. What actual change looks like is slow, consistent, and humble. It is showing up in small ways over extended times. It is demonstrating pattern change rather than announcing intention. It is accepting that trust in this context is not rebuilt through words. It is rebuilt through the patient accumulation of evidence. And even then, you may be working against a biological reality that has already moved too far in the direction of detachment to be fully reversed. I want to go deeper now into something that most conversations about empaths completely miss. And that is the role of what psychologists call the dark night of the soul in the empath's withdrawal process. Yes, there's a specific kind of internal experience that many empaths describe at some point in their lives, usually connected to a relationship or a series of relationships that push them past their limit. It is not simply sadness. It is not simply burnout. It is a fundamental reckoning with identity. Because when an empath has been deeply invested in another person for an extended period, some part of their sense of self becomes organized around that investment. Their identity includes being someone who cares deeply for this person. Their daily emotional rhythm includes the experience of that caring. And when they finally reach the decision point, when they finally acknowledge that the caring has run its course, there is a kind of identity dissolution that occurs alongside the relational one. They are not just losing the relationship, they are losing the version of themselves that existed in the context of that relationship. The person who stayed up late listening, the person who made space for the other's struggles, radiates. The person who held the emotional weight of two people because one of them could not or would not hold their own. That person has to be released along with the relationship. And that release is a form of grief that has no adequate language in our culture, because our culture celebrates moving on. Our culture celebrates getting over it. Our culture has no real ceremony for the kind of loss an empath experiences when they finally stop caring about someone they once loved with their whole system. This is why the aftermath of an empath's withdrawal can look strange from the outside. People expect anger. People expect drama. People expect visible signs of the ending. It radiates, but empaths who have done the internal work, who have moved through the invisible grief and arrived at the stage of genuine release, often look almost serene. And that serenity is unsettling to the people around them, especially the person who caused the withdrawal, because it communicates something final in a way that anger never could. Radiates. Anger still contains connection. Anger is still a form of caring, just a wounded one. When someone rages at you, some part of you knows they still care enough to feel something fierce about you. Radiates. But when an empath reaches true neutrality, when they look at you with kind eyes and feel genuinely nothing urgent, that is the most complete form of closure that exists in human psychology. And it cannot be manufactured. It cannot be performed. It arrives only after an enormous amount of internal work that happened completely out of your sight. Now I want to address something that comes up every single time this topic is discussed, and that is the question of whether an empath can ever truly come back after they have withdrawn. Whether the caring can be restored, whether the relationship can be rebuilt. The honest answer is that it depends entirely on which stage the withdrawal has reached. And it depends on something even more fundamental than that. It depends on whether the conditions that caused the withdrawal have genuinely changed, not in appearance, but in reality. If an empath is in the early stages, in the stage of secret hoping or quiet communication, and they are met with genuine responsiveness, genuine effort, real pattern change, radiates, there is absolutely the possibility of restoration. Empaths are not looking for perfection. They are looking for sincerity. They are looking for evidence that their investment matters to you, not as a possession, but as something precious. And when they encounter that evidence in a consistent and believable way, the caring does not just return, it deepens. Because now it is grounded in something real rather than hoped for. But if an empath has moved through the invisible grief stage, if they have done the internal processing of loss, radiates. If they have reached the withdrawal stage and beyond, the path back is extremely difficult. Not impossible, but extremely difficult, because you are not asking them to return to where they were. You are asking them to build something entirely new on ground that has already been grieved. Radiates. And that requires both of you to be operating a completely different level than the one that produced the original pattern. It requires honesty that goes beyond what felt comfortable before. Idiots. It requires vulnerability from the person who was not vulnerable. It requires the empath to take a risk that their whole system has already learned is dangerous. And I will tell you this plainly. Most relationships do not survive that level of required transformation, not because the people involved are bad people or incapable of change, but because change at that depth is genuinely rare. And empaths, after everything they have processed, have become very good at distinguishing real change from the desire for change. They can feel the difference, and they have learned, idiots, often through great pain, to trust what they feel over what they are told. But here's what I want you to take away from all of this, regardless of which side you are on. Radiates, regardless of where you currently stand in the geography of this dynamic. The moment an empath stops caring is not actually the end of the story. It is the punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence that was written long before that moment arrived. Radiates. And reading only the punctuation without reading the sentence means you understand nothing about what actually happened. The withdrawal of an empath is the final chapter of a story that began with extraordinary investment. It began with someone who chose repeatedly and deliberately to love deeply and give generously and hold space with a kind of patience that most people never receive in their lives. And somewhere along the way, that extraordinary investment was met with something less than it deserved, not necessarily with cruelty, not necessarily with malice, but with something that was simply not enough attention, not enough reciprocity, not enough recognition of what was being given. And so the empath, after processing all of this through their extraordinarily sensitive system, after hoping and communicating and grieving in private and withdrawing slowly, finally arrived at the place they never wanted to reach. The place where the caring is finished, radiates, where the investment has been fully withdrawn, where the emotional bank account is closed. And maybe the most important thing I can tell you about that place is this: it did not make them cold. It made them wise. The empath who stops caring is not the same person they were before they started caring. They are someone who loved fully, who gave enormously, radiates, who was patient beyond what was reasonable, and who eventually, at great personal cost, chose themselves. That is not failure. That is one of the most profound forms of growth a human being can undergo. Because the world teaches us that caring is always the right choice, that loving more is always the answer, that the virtuous thing is to keep giving regardless of what you receive in return. And there is beauty in that teaching, but there's also a lie buried inside it, and empaths eventually discover the lie. The lie is that love without self-respect is not actually love. Radiates. It is a performance of love. It is love that has lost its center, and when love loses its center, when it becomes entirely about the other person and nothing about the self, it begins to hollow out the person extending it until there is nothing left to give. The empath who stops caring has discovered something that very few people ever fully understand. Radiates. That sustainable love requires two people who both believe the other is worth showing up for. That genuine connection requires reciprocity at some fundamental level. Not perfect reciprocity, not transactional equality, but something that communicates through pattern and through presence, that both people consider what they have together to be worth protecting. When that communication is absent, when one person is consistently doing the emotional labor of two, when the investment is chronically one-sided, the empath's withdrawal is not a betrayal of love. It is love finally, belatedly, correctly applied to the self. And that self-directed love, that decision to stop pouring into something that cannot hold what you are giving, radiates. That is where the empath finally becomes whole, not in the giving, not in the staying, but in the honest and courageous act of stopping. So if an empath has stopped caring about you, radiates, understand what that means. It means they spent an enormous amount of time caring about you when it cost them. It means they stayed when leaving would have been easier. It means they chose you over and over again in private moments you never saw, in internal battles you never knew were happening. And it means that finally, after all of that, they chose themselves. And if you are the empath who has finally stopped caring, I want to say this to you directly. What you are experiencing on the other side of that withdrawal is not emptiness. Even though it can feel like emptiness at first, what it actually is space that was previously occupied entirely by someone else's emotional needs, space that is now yours. And what you fill it with, how you use it, how slowly and deliberately and wisely you choose who gets access to it next, that is entirely up to you. Radiates. Because the empath who has been through this process and emerged from it is not broken. They are calibrated. They know things about human nature now that cannot be learned from a book. They know what real investment looks like and what it does not look like. Radiates. They know the difference between someone who shows up because they want to and someone who shows up because they are afraid of losing. They know what their caring is worth because they experience what happens when it is taken for granted. And that knowledge, that deep and hard-earned knowledge, radiates, is the foundation of something most people spend their whole lives searching for. It is the foundation of a relationship with yourself that no one can take away. A relationship built on the recognition that your care is valuable, that your presence is precious, that your investment is not owed to anyone, that it is a gift offered freely, and deserving of something real in return. And the empath who finally understands that radiates, the one who has walked through the grief and the withdrawal and arrived at the other side with that understanding intact, that person will never again mistake tolerance for love. Will never again confuse patience with acceptance of what does not deserve to be accepted. will never again extend the full depth of their extraordinary capacity for connection to someone who treats it as ordinary, because they have learned what ordinary people never learn. That the most radical act of love available to a deeply feeling person is knowing when to stop, knowing when the caring has served its purpose and exceeded its welcome. Radiates, knowing when self-preservation is not selfishness but wisdom, knowing when the most loving thing you can do for yourself and ultimately for the other person is to finally, quietly, completely let go. When an empath stops caring, it is already over. But what begins in that moment, what grows in the silence that follows, what takes root in the space that the withdrawal creates, that is not over. That is only beginning, and it belongs entirely to them.